welcome everybody to this Thursday afternoon seminar. My name is Manuel Eisner. I'm the director of the Institute of Criminology, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. I will hand over to the chair of the evening today, Professor Barak Ariel. In a second, I just wanted to say a word of welcome to this seminar that with Zaibert and with Alison Diebling as a discussant have a large number of people here, but if you may be interested to hear that you are actually a minority here in the room, the majority of participants in this seminar are joining us online. At least telling from the registrations, we have about 80 or 90 people who are joining us online. Been thinking for a while about how to manage discussions in this situation where you have these hybrid environments. And the way we do this is with a little app that's called Slido. So Slido simply allows you to ask a question. You only have 160 characters, so you can only ask short questions. The good thing about this is that these questions are clear and focused. And the other good thing about these questions is that other people can like your questions. So other people can say, I think this is a really interesting question, and I would like this question to be discussed afterwards. There is a number here that leads you to the respective Slido. You can see this here. Now, because this slide is going to go, I recommend that either you write down the number or you enter Slido on your telephone or on your laptop, and you enter this number now. Oh yes, you can also take a photo. Also take a photograph of the number, and so you can then enter your question. It's all from me for now, and I'm delighted to hand over to Rob.
I'll be brief. Good evening, everybody. Pleasure to introduce our guest today. Very Professor Ariel, lawyer from Venezuela, into a philosopher in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Leo is the adjunct professor of penal theory and ethics. He recently joined us. So welcome. He is also the director of the Center for Penal Theory and Ethics. He specializes in penal theory and ethics. And he's going to be talking to us about punishment. And I would also like to have Alison Diebling, Alison Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice Director of the Institute of Criminology's Prison Research Center. Research is quite broad. The role of value is in life, the role of fairness in taking different experience.
Thank you very much. So this should be working, right? Thank you very much here. And to talk to you about the event. How do I go to my slide? Yep. All right. So let me just, before I get into the slides themselves, let me give a general, very brief introduction. What impresses in the relationship between punishment and amusement? The interest was sparked by the fact that I had taken for granted what are considered to be the orthodox and supposedly obvious ways these phenomena differ from each other. And I came to think that it did not work. It's very obvious contrast. And I wrote a paper just showing why they didn't.
And I thought that's what I was going to present today. Then, as please, I am getting interested in the topic as I was revisiting that old paper. So the first portion of my talk today is about that old paper. I will quickly move through those arguments, supposedly showing how punishment prevents differ that I don't think were. And then I will examine an essay by Simone de Beauvoir, in which there is an amalgamation, punishment and revenge. It's not the main topic of the essay, but I think that it is extraordinarily helpful to read. I think that the type of question that arises when we treat punishment and revenge as most people are typically done are really interesting. In the end, I will suggest, this is a good thing, but I will suggest that punishment and revenge do differ. But the way in which I'm going to make that distinction, first, is different from the usual ways. Distinction that I will make. And also, that way of distinguishing between the two phenomena flows nicely from the consideration of a text such as the Beauvoir, in which they are treated as very similar. I hope that that will be clear as I move on, but that's sort of the map of what's happening today. So, I will begin by examining Robert Nozick compiled, and that's a word that he used. This is not his original work. He simply went through the literature, allegedly showing how punishment and revenge differ, and then he compiled these basically 5 contrasts. The first one is retribution is done for a wrong, while revenge may be done for an injury or harm or slight and need not be for a wrong. Second one is that retribution sets an internal limit to the amount according to the seriousness of the crime, whereas revenge internally needs set no limit to what it inflicts. Third one is that revenge is personal, whereas the agent of retribution need have no special personal tie to the victim of the wrong for which he exacts. Fourth, revenge involves a particular emotional pleasure at the suffering of another, while retribution either need involve no emotional or involves another, namely pleasure at justice being done. The last one is that there need be the one or the other. The fifth one is there need be no generality in revenge, where the imposer of retribution, inflicting the third punishment for a wrong, is committed to the existence of some general principles primarily mandating punishment in other similar circumstances. I'm going to come back to each one of them in due course and very critically why I don't think they succeed. I will change the order in which I discuss them because I will present them in increasing order of plausibility. So I'll begin with the ones that I think are least plausible. But before I go into each of them individually, you might have noticed that something strange has happened, which is that Nozick is talking here about retribution, not about punishment. So I will establish a few terminological conventions. I hope not to have to get bogged down on this point, but we could in Q&A. In this context, we could treat retribution, retributive punishment, and punishment as synonyms. It's almost explicitly stated by Nozick, but for the purposes of our discussion, I am confident I can defend that one. I will use revenge and vengeance as synonyms too, as is often done, and I will use forgiveness, mercy, and charity as synonyms. The main reason I include that third element is that the Beauvoir will talk about this, and often she's talking about charity, by which I think she means something like forgiveness or mercy. All right, so back to the contrast. The first contrast is that retribution is done for a wrong, while revenge may be done for things that are not wrongs. And my main problem with this is that it's false. I do not know, just looking at literature, I mean, tales of revenge are a common genre. I don't think I have ever encountered, I mean, I'm not an expert in literature, but to the extent I look for them, I haven't encountered instances of avengers who are avenging what they think are mere slights. What is very common is that avengers are mistaken and they think that they were wrong when they weren't. But crucially, they think they were wrong. And it seems to me to fly in the face of the notion of revenge, that the agent of revenge would say, I wasn't wrong, but I am carrying out my revenge. That's not what's happening. But what often happens, and that's often an important part of the novel, of the play, is that the agent is exaggerating what happened, and he's not really at wrong, but she thinks it is, and that's crucial. Now, the problem is that punishers can also be mistaken in exactly the same ways. So this is not a very successful way of distinguishing between the two, because the possibility of mistakes is present in both cases. As long as what is being described is an avenger, she is responding to what she perceives is wrongdoing. Otherwise, there is no revenge. The revenge is about something that it's me, that I think I was wrong. Now, as I warned you, I'm moving very, very quickly over this because I want to get to other things. But I hope that the point can be made quickly. I mean, really, a punisher can be as mistaken as an avenger regarding the magnitude of what happened or the nature of what happened. The second contrast is that retribution sets an internal limit to the amount of punishment according to the seriousness of the wrong, whereas revenge internally needs set no limit to what is inflicted. I have a similar problem with this one. I think that's false. Revenge, like punishment, involves limits. I am willing to concede that the limits related to revenge might be looser. Maybe that's true, and certainly they are not systematic or need not be systematic, but they exist. The reason they exist, sorry, I did 2 clicks. The reason they exist is that the essence of revenge is to try to get even. So if what you're trying to do as you carry on with your vengeance is to get even, there's a built-in limit to what you would do. You could be more than even or less than even, but again, of course you could be mistaken, and it is often the case that avengers are mistaken, but it's not that there are no limits, it's just a misrepresentation, I would like to say, is a caricature of the avenger to say that she has no limits in mind. She has limits, and there are dangers with letting revenge run wild, because people often have the wrong limits. They have the wrong idea as to what getting even might mean, but that's what they think they are doing. The logic, the idea of getting even, belongs equally to punishment and revenge, equally in the sense of existing, not in the sense of being equally strict. I am willing to concede that perhaps there's more looseness in the case of revenge, but it is a misrepresentation to say that the limits are not there. Like I said, there is always a possibility of being mistaken, but that attaches to avengers and to punishers. The fifth contrast says that there need be no generality of revenge, whereas the impulse of retribution, inflicting the third punishment for a wrong, is committed to the existence of some general principles, prime and facie mandating punishment in other similar circumstances. Again, I think the essence of what the avenger thinks she's doing is to bring about justice. I repeat, she could be, and she often is mistaken, fine, but that's what she thinks she's doing. Insofar she thinks she's doing that, there is no obvious reason why she couldn't be committed to some general principles of behaving like that in every similar circumstances. Of course, she need not be. And again, the point applies equally to the punisher. The punisher also thinks that she's bringing justice about, and she too can be mistaken, and she too can be committed to general principles. Here there might be interesting, I guess, empirical work showing how avengers are less committed to that than punisher, and I'm open to that. But conceptually, there is no reason why the avenger might not be. In fact, I think there are avengers in at least cartoons or who are in fact committed to it. They are constantly avenging the injustice. I think the Batman is one of those, but don't quote me, I'm not an expert in that. But it could be. There is no conceptual reason why an avenger cannot be committed to general principles. That's why I say that avengers cannot be moved by general principles, and why is it that punishment must be so. Third contrast. Revenge is personal, whereas the agent of retribution need have no special or personal tie to the victim of the wrong for which she exacts retribution. again, this is getting more and more plausible in my estimation. I think that revenge does tend to be more personal than punishment, and certainly more than state punishment. In fact, part of the point of state punishment is to try to prevent the likely excesses of this interpersonal relationship. So, yeah, that might be, I find that plausible, but there is no reason why there could be a personal element very strong in the case of punishment too. So, I mean, I am conceding this, as I said, this is getting better as we go along. My conclusion is that they don't work in the end, but they are getting better. Still not terribly helpful, but better than the previous ones, in my opinion. It seems to me that it's too optimistic to think that this is a stable conceptual distinction. It might be a tendency, it might be something we observe, but conceptually, I don't see why revenge has to be more frequent than punishment. And the last contrast that I will analyze, which is the fourth, it says revenge involves a particular emotional tone, pleasure at the suffering of another, while retribution either need involve no emotional tone or involves another one, namely pleasure at justice being done. So the first thing I'm going to say might make it very strange to understand why I think this is the most promising. Because as stated, this is perhaps the worst of the contrasts, in the sense that it's hard to take seriously. Someone who simply enjoys the suffering of another is a sadist. It's not an avenger and he's not a punisher. Again, here there might be evidence that shows that, well, before I go to the evidence, it is possible to be an avenger and a sadist. Although I would then insist, it's also possible to be a punisher and a sadist. So the contrast is not good at the conceptual level. But it could turn out that as an empirical matter, we discover that sadist traits are more frequent on avengers. And, well, on the one hand, this is the one that I find most promising. And on the other, even if I didn't, I would be very happy to learn about that fact. But on the face of it, this characterization of the avenger simply enjoying the suffering of another is a caricature, I think. However, what I just explained, you could be both a sadist and an avenger, or a punishment and an avenger. Sorry, a punisher and a sadist, or an avenger and a sadist. But to focus on a different type of emotional reaction, there is an emotional difference between the punisher and avenger, I would suggest, which is not quite enjoying the suffering of another, but something having to do with emotions, which I think is a very promising way of distinguishing punishment from revenge. I want to say at once, maybe this is a good moment. If in the end of this talk, you are not convinced that even my attempt to distinguish punishment from revenge is very successful, I would take that as a victory somehow, because I do not think it's easy to do. But even if I fail when I present my own account, I think that is an interesting failure. Actually, there are other senses in which interesting failures will figure in this talk. Oh, so that's my account of the contrast. One interesting preliminary conclusion that I want to draw is that if we took these contrasts seriously, the avenger would look like a pretty nasty person. That is, that's someone who enjoys someone else's suffering, which he inflicts with no regards to rules, to proportionality, or to justice. Well, there's certainly nothing whatsoever attractive about that, I think. And in a way, I think that this view is the culmination of this contrast, which is, I came to see it as some sort of specious moral alchemy. Essentially, the same behavior is sanitized when we call it punishment, and it's all fine, or at least potentially fine. Whereas if we call it revenge, it's just necessarily very nasty and barbaric and so on. So that's it. Revenge is barbaric, punishment is not. And I have doubts about that simplistic way of putting it. I'll put it very similarly. I'll be open to the possibility that that statement is true, but I'll present reasons which are different from the ones just examined. All right. As I mentioned, I'll have a very brief section called Beyond Penal Theory, which is that if you look at literature and you read about any tale of revenge, any moment, again, this is outside of my area of comfort, punishment and revenge are used interchangeably in novels, in tragedies, in plays. And that was part, this might be autobiographical minutia, but that was part of what began planting the seed of skepticism in me as to the effectiveness of the general conference. Are all these literary figures and poets and dramatists just widely mistaken? I understand they are not supposed to be doing conceptual analysis, but it's something odd if they are really that off. So in any of these texts, you will find the terms used interchangeably. Now, they don't present the analytical apparatus trying to show, I'm going to use, it's not like Shakespeare will tell us, I'm going to now do this tragedy, and I'm going to use these terms interchangeably for this and that reason. It just happens. They write their play, or their tragedy, or their novel, and it happens that they are assumed to be the same thing. But my point is that it is helpful, or one of my points, to concentrate on texts in which there is some sort of amalgamation between the two. For my purposes, I have chosen the Beauvoir's article because not only this is happening there, but the subject matter is punishment. So it is both a text in which this is happening and which there is some reflection about the nature of punishment. There is no reflection, unfortunately, about them and about punishment and revenge being the same thing, but we get close to that, and I do think it's an interesting essay. I hope you will agree. The essay is very, very complex, and is very famously complex. I have read really strange interpretations of it. Some people assume it's an abolitionist manifesto. Others think it's a plea for restorative justice, and I reject these interpretations for whatever that's worth. It's not. I have very little interest in proving that I'm right about this, except I will, in passing, mention what the essay is about, and you'll see what I think those interpretations are correct. But part of the complexity stems from the fact that the Beauvoir leaves crucial concepts unexplained. So we are guessing as to what she might mean by some of the things that she says. I will try to elucidate some of these unexplained concepts in today's talk, I hope with some success. But the reason, again, I repeat, why I think it's worthwhile to engage in these essays, not only that I think it's a very good and profound essay, but I think that it invites the sort of reflection about punishment that I find rare, not very frequent. The type of question and the type of problem with which she's struggling here is very attractive to me as a theoretician. Even if I were to disagree with some part of her solution to the problems. All right, so this is an essay that was written in the aftermath of French collaborationism with the Nazis. It was explicitly about her refusal to sign a petition seeking to pardon Robert Brasillach, who was a famous collaborationist. But I highlight how expressive this was, because it just flags how strange it would be to see this as an abolitionist manifesto. She wanted Brasillach executed. That's what this article is about. She's saying, I don't want him pardoned. I think he should be executed. I'm not necessarily siding with her on that one. I'm just saying that's what it was about. She refused to sign that letter. By the way, the letter was unsuccessful. Brasillach was executed. And the article is evidently mistitled. Brasillach did not kill anyone himself. He celebrated the Nazis. He was a fascist. He was a all-around unsavory character and wars, but he didn't kill. So there is no eye for an eye going on here. She wanted him dead, even though he didn't kill anyone. Just to put it in terms of the saying, she wanted his eye without him having taken anyone's eye. So that already misleads, but there is something that in passing I want to mention, which is really very important, that in that error in the title, if I'm right, the Beauvoir is repeating an incredibly pervasive error in the specialized literature even, which is to think that being a retributivist means being in favor of the lex talionis. The two things are conceptually distinct. Of course, it could be both, and in fact, many retributivists have been both. Perhaps the popularity of the error can be traced back to the fact that Kant made this error. He thought this was the same thing. You are retributive, you believe people should get exactly the same thing, and so on and so forth. But there's absolutely no reason why it have to be, well, there are some reasons, they kind of go well together, but not necessarily. And I don't know, many retributivists I know, including myself, do not endorse lex talionis. So just in passing, the title of the essay is not very good. So I'm going to go through a few of the, how to call them, points that are useful for me to highlight in this essay. First of all, the Beauvoir claims that she was an abolitionist about common criminals in France before the Nazis. She gives explanations in passing about society was so unfair, they are not to blame, and all sorts of reasons why she never favored punishment for common criminals. But she claims the Nazis changed all that. And perhaps oddly, she comes across as disliking much more the Nazi collaborationists, French collaborationists, than the Nazis themselves. But fine, this event caused her to want punishment in a way that she never wanted to do before. I find what seems to be the supposition and animating her view that the Nazis invented this real evil. She called it sometimes absolute evil, sometimes radical evil, sometimes irredeemable evil. But I mean, I don't need to underestimate the evil the Nazis caused, but they did not invent evil. It existed before, it existed after, but fine. What I find valuable is to insist on the existence of things which are really evil. That is a premise of her argument, and I agree with her, regardless of where that line is drawn. I think the Nazis belong there, but so do other people or other groups. Now, the second point I want to highlight is that she rejects forgiveness in this case. Actually, I put it wrong. She rejects forgiveness for real evil. I might want to say, regarding Brasilac or the Nazis, I might reject forgiveness too, but I don't want a blanket rejection of forgiveness in the way that she draws it. She seems to suggest, no, she does suggest that in the presence of real evil, then forgiveness is always inappropriate. Some of my students from the course on punishment and mercy right now would know I do think that sometimes mercy, forgiveness is the right thing to do, even in the presence of real evil. And there is a risk, there is a risk, this would come later in the slide, it's no problem, you will forgive me. There is a risk that the Beauvoir might end up with the untenable position that forgiveness is only appropriate when the wrongdoing is not that serious. And if that's your view, it's a very uninspiring view of forgiveness. The interesting bit is how to forgive when the evil was real, I mean, serious. But she distinguishes herself from what she calls Christian ethics, and she says it is allowable for Christians to opt for charity, since they believe in the existence of a supreme and supremely just and supremely good, etc. Just. And then she says, but charity in this radical form, by the way, charity meaning forgiveness, mercy, is forbidden to men who affirm a human ethics and human values. And here, just in passing, I also want to register, well, one more thing. There are cases where no redemption appears possible because the evil that one runs up against is absolute evil. I don't agree with this blanket rejection of forgiveness, but it is true that forgiveness, just like punishment / vengeance, is sometimes justified, sometimes unjustified. I'm devoting my life to try to discover when or say something about when, but I do think that that is true. This bit is the one I wanted to say that it's interesting to contrast her position, the sort of blanket rejection of forgiveness, to Derrida's. I was trained to dislike Derrida officially. That was part of my training as a philosopher. But I do think that he has very interesting things to say about forgiveness. And in his grandiloquent style, he says, forgiveness can only exist in the presence of the unforgivable, by which I think he means in the presence of things that on their face do not look like good candidates to be forgiven. And I think that's an important insight. So I think that's a potential danger in de Beauvoir's position. But the point I wanted to mention is that in insisting on the value or the limited scope for mercy for secular theorizing, she is basically repeating what is a common trope in retributivist thinking. And I just in passing mentioned perhaps the most radical living retributivist, Michael Moore, has passages explaining his commitment to retributivism in virtually identical terms to de Beauvoir. And I find that is an interesting point. The next important bit in de Beauvoir's essay concerns emotions, which you might remember I linked to that of the last of the contrasts that I find the most plausible. He says that French collaborationism with the Nazis taught her hatred and rage, and that she never felt this emotion before, certainly not against common criminals. But she says, now I feel it. And she says that she felt, and she's quite eloquent about the visceral and intensity of this feeling, the need to punish, to avenge ourselves. I mean, in passing, it's nice in this little bit that she's equating punishment and I mean, this happens throughout the essay. And then she adds that this need is a spiritual appetite. And then she adds, and I think bitterly, that man does not live on bread alone, that it is part of the existential angst or the fact that we are humans, we will feel this deep urge. And I want to say a couple of things. She spoke in the passage I quoted and throughout the text, mostly on hatred and rage. But I think it is actually quite important not to limit this admittedly visceral and intense and pleasant emotion to those two emotions. So when I have written about these topics or similar ones, I have left it purposely very open. So I think outrage, indignation, anger, resentment, disappointment, and others are also possible reactions. But the important bit is the nature of not only the nature, the importance of this emotional component. That is something that I think comes out quite forcefully if you think of punishment and revenge as somehow similar rather than as so radically different. The spiritual need of which she talks about quoting is so deep that it can hold practical interests in check. And once again, I find a passage that she describes, which I think is quite illuminating. She says it would be absurd to suppose that they, that is the anti-fascist partisans, shot Mussolini to intimidate further dictators. Of course, they might have been aware, I don't know if their mind would have been in those long-term projects, but they might have been aware that this was a likely outcome. But the reason they were doing that had nothing to do with deterrence or certainly not rehabilitation, but none of those other things. They wanted him to suffer, and in this case, to die. That was the essential bit. The same thing is true of any Avenger in literature. What they want, what the Avengers want, is the wrongdoer to suffer for its own sake. In some cases, that is perfectly compatible with other good things that may come afterwards, but that's not what the Avenger is after. They are after just inflicting this suffering, which they find intrinsically good. I think that Punishers share this to an extent, but this is beginning to delineate how I'm going to try to distinguish them, the two phenomena. All right, the fourth, and I think important for my purposes, very important for my purposes, the fourth element I want to highlight in her essay is the importance of plot, which is not a typical topic in Pinot theory, but I wish it were more so. So it is not just that the Avenger wants the suffering or values the suffering for its own sake, but that the way in which this suffering comes to happen is crucially important. This is a long passage, but I like it. If the tyrant decided, without pressure from outside, to repent of his errors, even if, carried away by remorse, he were to apply the law of an eye for an eye to himself, perhaps vengeance would be disarmed, but it would not be satisfied. for he would remain the master of his regrets, of his destiny. He would remain a pure freedom, and even in the suffering he might voluntarily inflict upon himself, he would continue to mock his victims in spite of himself. He himself must feel himself a victim, must endure violence. The violence here means the punishment, the suffering. And I think that this is really an important point. Yeah, I'll tell you why. The point is that the wrongdoer needs to be made to suffer by agents other than himself, in a way and a time of their choosing, and in response to the emotions that they are feeling. I am much less opposed to the value of the self-punishment that she describes here, but I'm going along with the importance of plot here. That's what I want to distill from this discussion. But this concern with plot sets off the deepest problem that I think she identifies in the essay. Before I get to that deepest, I have one slide just to take stock about what I think has happened. There are three characteristics that punishment and revenge share that I'm going to mention here. They are both responses to perceived wrongdoing by someone who is emotionally affected by that perceived wrongdoing, and who, in order to realize the value of justice, seeks to make the perceived wrongdoer suffer, and suffer in a very particular way. The reason I want to stop here and take this little detour, which is really, back to the main point anyhow, is that if I'm right, or roughly right about these commonalities, it does invite a very urgent question. How come the standard approach to punishment and revenge is about how different they are, when at least they are similar in this respect? Again, I will suggest all the differences, but there's something odd about allegedly two phenomena that share so much, typically taken to be so radically different. So that's just a stop for the panel. Now, going back to the issue of the importance of plot. Here I'm going to read a few passages that I find illuminating. While de Beauvoir was in favor of Razinak's execution, she was very disappointed with the trial itself. And I think, so I have three passages, I think, in this slide. The lawyers, the judges, even the public played a role. The question, the lawyers' summations are involved with all the pomp of a comic drama. Only the accused, Razinak, belonged to that world of flesh where bullets can kill. The more the trial takes on the aspect of a ceremony, the more abominable it seems that it might end in a real spilling of blood. For all the concern for purity, legal sanctions fail to achieve the concrete goal they have set themselves. They are nothing but an empty form that only the plenitude of content could justify. The expression, the plenitude of content, is mesmerizing. It seems nice, but it's not very clear to me what exactly she means by it. But I suggest that part of what she means to include by that is the real emotional dimension outside of the courtroom that somehow our legal system tends to finish or eliminate, something about the reality of the felt emotions of the avenger. Incapable of incorporating this rich emotional dimension that is required for realizing justice, the judicial process cannot aspire to incorporating the right plot in anything resembling the requisite manner. The problem is that, as you will see, de Beauvoir is not happy with the alternative. So she says, as soon as the avenger aspires to set himself up as a judge, vengeance becomes suspect. And she adds, vigilantes provoke our indignation as much for the tranquil arrogance with which they decide the crime and the punishment as for their cruelty. So I call this last point despair. I don't think she uses this word, but I think that characterizes, at least for my purposes, what's going on. The despair is the result that she doesn't like either of the apparently exhaustive categories. She doesn't like the criminal justice system in its watering down of the reality of what punishment should be, but she doesn't like the wild vigilante justice either. So that's the sense in which I think there is an element of despair. She says, well enough, it is necessary to punish without hate, by which I mean we should understand, by which I suggest we should understand not necessarily hate, but the sort of deep emotional dimension I was describing. It could be resentment, could be outrage, could be disappointment, but she said, we are told. And she says then, yet I think this is precisely the error of official justice. Only vengeance bites into the world. And then I have this bit. Her despair is because only vengeance bites into the world, but that bite is repugnant. So she is facing a real serious problem. Now, because of what I'm calling despair, I think we can understand one of the two main conclusions in the essay. This conclusion is all punishment is a failure. By the way, sometimes he says entails a failure, sometimes he says implied a failure. I will talk about being a failure, just taking that liberty. The other main conclusion of her essay is that to punish is to recognize man as free in evil as well as in good. It is to distinguish evil from good in the use that man makes of his freedom. And in the final analysis, punishment is nothing less than to will the good, which is an incredibly nice take on punishment. I do not think that the two conclusions complement each other too well. I mean, is it really willing the good always a failure? I think she would say yes, but this leads me to problematize the notion of failure. I think that claiming that punishment is always a failure, or in any of the other formulations, entailing a failure or implying a failure, is really important and is on. She's on to something that I find valuable. But since she doesn't tell us what this failure is, it's hard to take my word for it. I'll try to sketch what I think she might be thinking of, or certainly if she wasn't thinking about that, that's fine with me. That's what I think is a possible loss of what's happening here, and I think a useful one. The things that she says are, I find them moving, but I don't think they suffice. They don't do the trick of what we need here. She says, in the same way as hatred and revenge do, love and action always imply a failure. But this failure must not keep us from loving and acting. Man is wretched, scattered, admiring the given, but he's also a free being. The problem is that even if we buy that, and we think we understand what she's saying, even if we're generous with her, this says nothing specific about the failure that punishment might be. If we understand that by these passages, we would then be left with a relatively unhelpful point that everything is a failure. So of course, punishment is part of the things that exist in the world, and it would be a failure too. I don't think that is too helpful. So I'll try to offer an account of failure in which some particular ways in which punishment itself is a failure come across. So that's the rest of my talk today, trying to shed some light on a possible sense of failure here. But in order to do that, I have to come back, or I think I want to come back to the distinction between punishment and revenge, because I think that that connects nicely and will set the stage for that distinction. So this is my attempt to distinguish punishment from revenge after the insights that I think we can glean from her essay. I will try to do this by attending to two dimensions. I am not at all confident with the labels I given to each of them, and I am all ears for suggestions how to call them better. But just to give them some name, I will call one the aesthetic dimension and the other one the simple-mindedness overconfidence dimension. And I will explain what I mean by that second one, which is particularly mouthful, but I'll try to explain. Now, in de Beauvoir's essay, there's a nice passage in which she says, the moment when Mussolini cries, no, no, in front of the firing squad, satisfies hate, that is the correct emotion outlook, far more than the moment when he collapses beneath the bullets. I think that this is just confirmation of the point I highlighted before. The plot matters. The way in which the suffering gets to happen is really important. I think that something like this must have been true of this case. Seeing the tyrant who has been responsible for all these atrocities bad for his life might have been particularly important for the people carrying out justice in that moment. I don't need to settle on a percentage. Is it more important than the actual? I don't know, but it was really important and important for its own sake. But, and here's the beginning of the way I would like to make the distinction along the first dimension. This sort of thing matters much more for the avenger than for the punisher. Think of famous cases in which we have felt Ariel Castro was some criminal in the US a few years ago who had kidnapped some young girls when they were very young, 5 or 6, and he had them chained in his basement in Cleveland, Ohio. There was some horrible thing, and eventually one of them escaped. And after he was caught and so on, well, I forgot if he was awaiting trial or had already been convicted. I think he was already convicted, but then he committed suicide in prison after a month of being in prison. Many people felt robbed of justice. Jeffrey Epstein, I think, is a more famous case, the billionaire child sex abuse ring, and again, he apparently committed suicide in prison. Many people feel robbed of justice. Notice the reaction of the criminal justice system or legal authorities, say about Epstein's suicide, alleged suicide, was understandably concerned about what happened with supervision here. How could this happen in our prison? But it was not a concern with plot. I mean, it seems strange. I mean, I have no criticism in this one. I do have one at a different level, but I understand perfectly why prison authorities would have been primarily, if not exclusively, concerned with this breakdown in supervision. I mean, this should not have happened. And why it would be troubling if the concern was, well, but the plot here didn't work. However, not only the victims and potential victims of the public at large, but certainly an imagined avenger would feel fully robbed of justice. You have cases in which it was not suicide. Mengele dying while taking a swim in the ocean in front of his villa in Brazil is particularly annoying to some of us. I mean, I didn't employ anyone, but when I found out that that happened, there was something disappointing about that plot not happening. This highlights also, that's what I said, that if I end up not succeeding in distinguishing punishment from revenge, that's fine with me, because punishers could care about plot, but I do think that avengers, by definition, have to care, and have to care much more than punishers need, or they could. And I want to say something here about this. This was a new expression. My mother tongue is not in. So when I came to the US and I learned English and I heard about this expression, it took me a while to understand what it meant. There's no equivalent in Spanish. And then basically at some point I got the sense of it, which is that if you let time go by, then revenge is sweeter. It tastes better, it feels more, I don't know, rewarding or something along those lines. But what I have come to conclude is that it's not really time that matters, it's the plot. Now, typically, plots need some time to evolve, but it is not the time. Time is necessary for the plot to evolve, but what people care about is the plot, not so much the time. I won't bother, but in Q&A, I have presented examples in which a long time goes by and the avenger then gets her revenge, but it's not at all satisfying, even though it was a long time, and sometimes much shorter periods elapsed, and yet the mise en scène is so delightful that then it's much, delightful in the sense of justice, that then there is much more satisfaction in that regard. So again, I think that the saying, the kernel of truth in this saying has to do with plot, not with time. This is what I just said. Of course, imagine the supplications by Mussolini. Had they taken longer to happen? Would that have been more satisfying to the partisans? I don't think so. So I think it's very easy to produce examples in which the time alone is not making a big difference, even though as a matter of logic or physics, we need time in order for there to be any plot. But what matters is the plot. Punishers can be obsessed with the plot, but avengers must. In the very formulation of this point, you see the limitations of my distinction, because there could be a case of punishment and a case of revenge in which the importance of plot is the same. In that case, I have no way of distinguishing them yet. But this leads into my second dimensional on which I would like to distinguish them. And this is that simple-mindedness over confidence. The Avenger is obsessed, I guess that's a word I want to use, with her plan, with hatching it, with its unfolding, with all the details of how this is going to play out. Almost by definition, she has no room for misgivings, for doubts, or for any ambivalence whatsoever regarding the normative appropriateness of what she's doing. If she's cooking up this revenge and then she succeeds, it's fantastic. That's the point. There's no room for doubts. In this regard, the Avenger is remarkably simple-minded. Now, I'm using the word simple-minded in the way Bernard Williams used it. This is his definition. He says, you're simple-minded when you have too few thoughts and feelings to match the world as it really is. I find that incredibly profound, and it informs many of my writings. He initially introduced the idea of simple-mindedness to criticize utilitarians, because they are simple-minded, in his opinion, and I agree. But then he eventually used it to criticize huge portions of moral theory. He was very quick to add immediately the following sentence, that by simple-mindedness, he did not mean lack of intellectual sophistication. So you could be super bright and super sophisticated and simple-minded. But on that bit, I will disagree with him, because I will suggest that for my purposes here today, the simple-mindedness that I detect in the Avenger, that the Punisher could also exhibit, but that the Avenger must exhibit, is a strike against her. I mean, it is a bad thing. It is a sign of a type of, it's a moral failure. It is a, I'll try to explain why I mean that. So, Punishers could be simple-minded and overconfident, but they only Avengers must. Criminal justice systems, systems, can be simple-minded and overconfident, in fact, as well. When it's a complicated, I haven't done the homework for today's presentation, how that could work out. But if you have a system that reproduces in whatever systemic way the individual case would be, the sort of certitude about the rightness of these punishments and the lack of remorse and regret or ambivalence, you could be reproducing this type of simple-mindedness. But think for a second about a judge who, for whatever reason, finds her hands tied by the legal system and has to impose a certain sentence with a heavy hand. I've read about accounts of this sort, and I don't remember if this is something that has happened. You could be a functionary in the legal system and feel bad in ways yet to be specified, but which are very interesting, morally speaking, bad about what you do, have a heavy heart as you do it. This, in my opinion, is conceptually impossible in the case of the Avenger. An Avenger with a heavy heart is, to that extent, no longer an Avenger. I think that there are great cases in literature. I'm not going to go there in any detail, but Hamlet does not, to me, seem as the stereotype of the Avenger, even if that's what, precisely because he has doubts. And in my opinion, which is, I will drop it immediately, I don't want to get tangled up in that, that's part of the immense beauty of that text, because there is a deep problem over which he agonizes. Again, Avengers cannot have a heavy heart. It seems to me that when Nietzsche, for example, famously warned, mistrust all in whom the right to punish is strong, he must have had in mind what I'm calling here an Avenger. The person who is just ready, trigger happy, just delighted to be inflicting these sufferings, even if justifiable. The problem is that punishment, even when justified, and you could plug in whatever justification you want. I would plug in something that has to do with the cert, but you don't have to. Even if justified, presents us with a formidable moral dilemma. We bring about the good of justice by means of making someone suffer. And I'm stipulating, I hope I'm not going out on a limb, that making people suffer is in principle a bad thing to do. But you are doing the good by doing something that is prima facie bad. And that is a deep, irresolvable moral dilemma. I am reminded, I think, William Roberts' Introduction to Criminal Justice book, you begin by pointing out, and this is something I have not plagiarized, I have used it often, I give you credit when I do these. The criminal justice system serves many goals. And some of those goals are not only many, but they are in conflict with each other. I want to claim that the conflict between punishment and mercy, between the badness of making people suffer and the goodness of doing justice, is the theoretical birthplace of all the other ones. I mean, I don't need to defend that today, but there is something deeply, deeply central and fundamental about that tension. But when we decide that we ought to punish and that all things considered that's the right thing to do, that doesn't mean that the badness of making people suffer just vanishes into thin air. It remains. A term that moral philosophers recently have used to explain that is that there is a moral remainder. This remainder doesn't go away. It stays there, and it could give rise, it could justify all sorts of stress and complicated emotions on our part and ambivalence about what we are doing. And I would want to believe that this sort of thing could be incorporated into the way we think about state punishment in ways that I have certainly nothing to say today. And if you ask me, oh, well, you have something to say some other day, I hope so, but it's just, that's where I want to go with my research. I want to see how these reflections can affect the way we think about punishment in general. Some punishers can be allowed to this dilemma, but no avenger can. The moment the avenger has doubts and ambivalence, she's no longer an avenger by definition, I want to say. And I think that this is a useful gloss on what the Beauvoir might mean by failure. Punishment is a failure because it doesn't resolve neatly, even when you're justified. It leaves these moral remainders. And I'm sure I'm jumping ahead, but I think I have very few slides left. Being a failure in this regard is a good thing. The avenger, when she succeeds, did not fail. There is no failure from her perspective. She did exactly the right thing. The bad wrongdoer gets the justice that he deserves, and that's the end of it. Now, moral remainders of which I'm talking about seem to me more specific to punishment than the best I could do with the Beauvoir's article. Like everything is a failure, then this is a failure too. The particular failure of punishment has to do with that central tension between, let's call it benevolence, not wanting to make people suffer, and justice. That is, sometimes justice involves making people suffer. It's not everything we do involves that particular tension. Punishment and maybe a smallish subset of similar phenomena displayed. So if I'm right about this, if this isn't the right track, that is a problem for the Beauvoir's amalgamation of punishment and revenge. Because if I'm on the right track, there is a way of making a distinction, or the beginnings of a way of making a distinction. And I still think that it was worthwhile to read the Beauvoir and share with you what I found valuable there, because I think these type of concerns, these types of worries are not typically discussed. I mean, they are, but not very frequently by penal theorists. When the avenger succeeds in carrying her plan, I'm repeating myself, but it's an important point. From her perspective, there's absolutely nothing to regret. That is the type of primitivism that I think might justify saying something like revenge is barbaric, punishment is not. I don't know if the word barbaric captures that point, but fine, so be it. And if not, then use a different word. There is something uninspiring about having so much lack of nuance in your moral outlook. So I have a conclusion, call it parting thoughts. I think there's only 2 more slides. And I don't even know if this is a conclusion, but if not that, it is a parting thought. And they are related to the idea that Some failures are good. The failure that punishment might be, if my gloss or my development on whatever things that is correct, is a good thing to have. So punishers can experience the distress of moral remainders, avengers cannot. It is good. I don't know why they twisted like that. For punishment to involve a failure, a deep sense of failure. And whether, as I said, the word barbaric is what captures this is irrelevant. What seems to me unquestionably true is that there's something primitive, something uncouth, something unsophisticated, something uninspiring about not being able to have sufficient thoughts and feelings to match the world as it really is. The world is complicated. And one of the very complicated things, which is of great concern to most of us here and online today, is punishment, is that act of making people suffer. Now, the Avengers ignores that moral complexity by simple-mindedly assuming that the unfolding and completion of her plot have magical properties that utterly annul the badness of inflicting suffering, even if said suffering is deserved or otherwise just. Her moral universe is depressingly, to me, barren. The state, on the other hand, ignores moral complexity by simple-mindedly assuming that the sanitized and choreographed proceedings of the criminal trial have magical properties that utterly annul the badness of inflicting suffering, even if said suffering is deserved or otherwise justified. So its moral universe is also depressingly barren. And in what sorry. The last point, I thought there was one more point. The last point I want to make is this, that revenge does not cease to be revenge merely because the suffering is inflicted by the state. Typically, in the literature, the way the typical approach is to say, listen, the state, by stepping in and curbing the excesses, is civilizing the whole process. That's what civilization means, and living, in a civilized society. However, if I am on the right track here, part of what the state should, or part of what we should focus on when we evaluate the state punishment apparatus is whether the attitudinal primitivism that I have suggested attaches to vengeance is also abandoned. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done here. How exactly is the state attitudinally primitive? But I think that work can be done. The essence of revenge, if I'm on the right track, is not so much. I mean, I don't need to, again, give percentages, but it's certainly not only it's potentially excessive punishments. It is first and foremost the result of these simple-minded moral attitude. And if we are preserving that at the level of the state, that would be a problem for the criminal. I mean, certainly a possible objection, a way of approaching our criticism and our evaluation of criminal justice systems. I think that is, that even if they perhaps avoid other unsavory aspects of revenge, many criminal justice systems, it seems to me, do exhibit this primitivism. And again, that's an interesting lens into ways in which the discussion of the connection between punishment and revenge brings to the fore these other issues that I discussed with you today. I don't know if I resolved anything, but I find those discussions valuable. Interesting. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I don't know. Thank you, first of all, Leon, for that fantastic paper, so rich with ideas. This is your first formal lecture to us as the newly established Andreas von Hirsch Professor of Penal Theory and Ethics, I think. So might I just say what precious gifts both this newly endowed position and your appointment to it are for us as an institute. It's exciting for all of us to be talking punishment with someone who humbly describes himself as only a moral philosopher. There's so much to respond to in your paper, but I'm going to restrict myself to 4 or 5 main comments or questions. So first, I want to thank you for bringing Simone de Beauvoir's thought-provoking essay, An Eye for an Eye, to our attention. I've now read it twice and recommend it strongly to anyone who hasn't encountered it yet. As you point out, she describes all punishment as failure. One of her problems with punishment is that, as she puts it, social justice does not consider the guilty party in the totality of his being. It condemns the guilty party insofar as he is the substrate and reflection of certain evil acts. Punishment is abstract, whereas individuals are actual. She still calls for it in extreme cases of wrongdoing, however, arguing, as you told us, that we fail at love and still do it, so why not act as if agents make choices? They should be recognised as free and therefore be held accountable for both their good and what she calls their evil actions. I much prefer Mary Midgley's concept of the absence of good over the term evil, but that's another matter. Both of you are raising the question of what happens morally if we don't punish. What you do so brilliantly, and you started it in your wonderful book, here's a plug for his wonderful book, Rethinking Punishment, is specify the nature of punishment's failure. It is a failure, at least in the sense that it does not resolve neatly, that it leaves remainders, moral remainders. Punishers, as well as victims, suffer moral distress in light of the many imperfections of punishment in practice. Or do they? I would love to know more about the moral consciences and character of judges. Who are they morally? Are they ever, or should they be, heavy-hearted? We know, I think, that victims rarely feel pleasure in what we call justice, and that punishment does not repair the harm done. This is especially the case in certain crimes, like murder and sexual violence, where the victim may love as well as fear the offender. The sentence, taken by most theorists to be the moment of punishment, is where most of the moral problems begin. This is especially the case where punishment as it is practiced looks and feels more like revenge. And I think this is where we are these days, more Old than New Testament, and not much loving concern. A well-informed insider recently described current penal practice as sadistic. Your conceptual distinction between punishment and revenge is really helpful. I think we also need to understand where the empirical thresholds lie between the two. Perhaps we should explore the real presence of avenging attitudes among politicians, policymakers, and even criminal justice practitioners. So we can turn to the question of prisoners' suffering, a topic we know a lot about in the Prisons Research Centre. And your paper raises so many questions about what the relationship might be between what kinds or degrees of suffering and moral growth, or indeed corrosion. Jonathan Jacobs has argued persuasively, based on empirical data from our centre, that contemporary prisons more often damage character and the civic disposition than repair it. Catherine Orty and I have found that only a very small proportion of high moral quality prisons reduce rather than generate all forms of violence. At the very least, surely there should be a closer correspondence between our claims and arguments for punishment and empirical data on how the punishment feels, as Niels Christie put it, and its actual effects on the punished, their families, victims, and communities. So is the world ever a better place when the wrongdoer is suffering? De Beauvoir argues that suffering is intended to bring about a realization that the punished is a material being too, not just a subjective being able to treat others as things. Does it, as she proposes, restore human reciprocity by forcing the punished to realize his own materiality? How much suffering caused by which aspects of punishment is justifiable or successful in motivating reform? I'd really like to know your views on this matter. Punishment's moral effects may be counterproductive beyond a certain legitimacy threshold, persuading the punished that the state deserves their derision. So de Beauvoir argued, as you told us, that we must will the good by rejecting evil. Many others have argued similarly that laws have no meaning if they're not backed up by sanctions. David Garland asserted in Punishment and Social Order that punishment's expressive function is far more meaningful and effective than its instrumental function. and this explains its persistence in the face of instrumental failure. He called punishment a tragic social institution, rather than a singular kind of event, a flawed and morally contradictory solution to problems of conflict, regulation, and social relations. I think you agree with him. So why do you think we need so much more punishment of a more vengeful kind than we used to? Almost finally, let's talk emotions, since you raised the topic. And I'm ashamed to say that I once felt hatred and rage towards a perpetrator when someone I loved was severely injured in an act of right-wing extremist violence in Norway. One of the convicted perpetrator's guardians was a student on our MST, a Norwegian prison governor. He quietly counselled me that civic society required civility, especially in punishment, no matter how vicious the offence. Meanwhile, several officers in our penal system acted with violence towards two perpetrators of a different act of extremist violence. Whose system works best? And are we clear what we mean by works? Was my hatred and rage, after all, a cultural rather than spiritual appetite? My final theme, which I don't want to take more time to develop, are your prescient simple-mindedness overconfidence point, which I assure you has parallels in prison security and disciplinary proceedings, and time, which you touch on very briefly. We've done a bit of measuring of simple-mindedness using William Muir's language of tragic versus cynical perspectives or oversimplifying frameworks. It's found in greater degrees in the more punitive and damaging prisons. And last, we punish using time, but has anyone considered the impact of time on our relationship with punishment after it's been declared in court? So how do victims, punishers, and offenders feel long after the drama is over? Why do we end the plot or imagine its culmination so early in the actual process? It's so clearly a drama of good and evil. Do your moral remainders, in the end, ruin the plot? So you've given us such a lot to think about, and I'm sure by now the audience are bursting to join in. So thank you very much.